On the show today, we have Rabbi Asher. How are you, Rabbi?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Great. Awesome. By the way, what part of the country do you live in?
I live in South Florida, in a town called Hollywood.
Hollywood, okay.
Yeah.
I grew up in L.A., but we have a Hollywood there, too. I'm sure you heard of it, right?
I think so, yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, let me go ahead and go with the questions straight off the bat here. Who is considered to be Jewish and who is not considered to be Jewish? And is that important?
Mm-hmm. The bigger question is, according to who? According to the State of Israel, they have one standard. According to the Bible, that's a completely different standard. So, what do you mean specifically?
What is the State of Israel considered to be Jewish, and what is the Torah believed to be Jewish?
So the State of Israel acknowledges someone's father, their paternal line, not just their maternal line, which is typically the way Orthodoxy or traditional Judaism determines who's Jewish. The State of Israel believes that if any of your parents are Jewish, even if your great-great-grandparent is Jewish, either from the mother's side or the father's side, you are a Jew and you're eligible to partake in the rite of return. Now, the Torah has a different standard. The Torah, well, first of all, let's define Jew, right? Because even the word Jew doesn't necessarily appear in the 5 books of Moses. The notion that does appear is the idea of being in a covenant with God. So the question is, who is in a covenant with God, or how can someone enter that covenant? So we know that the Hebrews on Mount Sinai entered that covenant by saying Nasiv and Ishma, by taking upon themselves the yoke of God's commandments. And the Torah even tells us that alongside with them, there was a mixed multitude of peoples, right, not of Hebrew stock, who entered into that covenant in the same way. They're not called Jews in the Torah, right? They're called people who are in the covenant, personified within a nation called Israel. In Halakha, the word that's typically translated as Jew is the word Israel. Now, Jew is really, colloquially, is something used in America. For example, not every culture, every society refers to Israel as Jews. For example, like if you're Russian, you would still be referred to as a Hebrew, right? So only because we use the word Jew to refer to someone from the stock of Israel or possibly someone in a covenant with God, I mean, it doesn't really tell us much, because someone could be colloquially a Jew and not even believe in God, right? With the leading atheists, Richard Dawkins, Carl Sagan, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, these are all Jews, halachic Jews, i.e. they have Jewish mothers, but from a religious perspective, they're not in any covenant with God. So we really have to sort of split hairs.
So according to Israel, they would be considered Jews, but according to the Torah, they're in a way not really considered Jews because they're not doing the rituals or anything.
And not even Israel in general. For example, there's 2 branches in Israel. There's something called the Sochnut, which is the Jewish agency, and then there's the Rabbanut, which is the rabbinical authority. So the rabbinical authority only acknowledges you as a Jew if your mother's Jewish. And the Jewish agency, which actually runs the rite of return, includes the paternal side as well. And there's a war between both sides. I mean, I lived in Israel for 5 years. I made Aliyah. I had to jump through a lot of loopholes because I wasn't born Jewish. I converted to Judaism 20 years ago. So there's a war between the religious and the secular. And the secular run the Jewish agency. They're the ones who validate reform, conservative conversions, while the Orthodox, who are in charge of conversions in the land of Israel and in charge of marriage, are very strict on who they consider Jewish and not consider Jewish. This is why there's a lot of Russians in the State of Israel who are, yes, Israeli. The Jewish agency has validated them as Jewish in the colloquial sense, but the Rabbanut will not perform a marriage if you marry one of them because they don't consider them Jewish. So even though they're Israelis serving in the Israeli army, they're still made to reconvert if they want to marry.
In a way, they're Israeli just in terms of the state. They're just like a citizen of a place called Israel. And going back to the where your mother has to be Jewish, I read somewhere that the reason for that was because in antiquity, I guess a lot of rape would go along. And so the only way that they would know that you're an actual Jew, it was only because they would track you back to your mom. And sometimes people wouldn't know who your dad was. So that's why they kind of created that.
So that's the most practical understanding. That's not how it necessarily appears in the Talmud. There's actually 3 different opinions in the Talmud, and it seems that But the notion went back and forth, and we finally decided to poskin, to hold by this one. But the Torah doesn't say that. I mean, the Torah doesn't say what makes somebody Jewish. The only thing the Torah says is what determines what tribe you're in, and that's your father, right? If you're a Cohen, if you're a Levi, it's because your father was a Cohen or a Levi. In terms of what makes someone Jewish, I don't think that was really a question ever brought up in the Torah, because if you were in Israel, right, of Hebrew stock, i.e. from one of the tribes, of course you were an Israelite, of course you were a Jew. That's only a question that would really come up in Galut, in exile, right? This is why the Torah doesn't deal with that, because they assume if you're suffering with Israel, being occupied by the Romans or whatever, of course you're a Jew, you're an Israelite, but that doesn't mean you're in the covenant. That doesn't mean that you're in any relationship with God, right? Larry David is a Jew, he's not in a covenant with God, nor does he want to be, right? We're really splitting hairs, but this is something most people don't talk much about. And this is why when anti-Semites that want to find the Jew to hurt, the first Jew they attack is the one who looks Jewish, right? With a kippah, with a beard or whatever. And they don't know that not all Jews look like this. They really can't distinguish between religious Jews and secular Jews. So you have a lot of religious Jews suffering the consequences of decisions made by secular Jews, right? I mean, the average religious Jew is not necessarily a Zionist, at least in the Haredi world. Like a religious Jew who would have a black hat, long peyot, long beard, a black coat. Most of these guys are anti-Zionists, but for some reason the anti-Semites paint them all as Zionists because the actual Zionists are 9 out of 10 times not religious and have some sort of ancient Bolshevik agenda, right? That's what's typically taught by these anti-Semites online. So this is why, I mean, I think it's a great question and it doesn't get answered enough.
Yeah, it's. I guess it's a very complicated question, with a complicated answer. And now, people say Jesus was a Jew. Can that be technically true if, when certain Israelites went to Babylon and created the whole rabbinical kind of school of doing things, and when they came back, in a way, Jesus was against them because they became, in a way, Jews, and they didn't conserve or retain their Israelite kind of culture. Technically, was Jesus a Jew or is he an Israelite?
But just to respond to a few other things you just said, I'm an Orthodox Jew. I don't believe that the Jews made up Rabbinic Judaism in Babylon. We as Orthodox Jews believe that Rabbinic Judaism is just the role of the judge that appears in the Torah, translated in a post-Babylonian form. In other words, clearly the judges weren't called rabbis, but they were called judges. And these are the guys who sat on the Sanhedrin. And then Jesus wasn't necessarily against them. I mean, he was just against the Sadducees as he was the Pharisees, right? I mean, he liked some, he disliked others. But there are many things that Jesus kept that follow the rabbinic tradition and not some literal understanding in Torah.
Oh, okay. I thought for some reason he was like he had a literal understanding of the Torah, and he kind of wanted to go back to that classical version and kind of rejected the Talmud and everything that came after that.
Right. No. Here, for example, there's an example of him blessing the food before he eats. Now, everyone knows that the Torah says that you shall eat, be satisfied, and then bless the Lord. In other words, the law is to bless after you eat, but the rabbis instituted the whole idea of blessing before. But we know that he celebrated Hanukkah. Now, Hanukkah is a rabbinic holiday. So the rabbis, i.e. those who sat in the court, had civil authority to institute practices just to keep Israel progressing in a unifying manner, right? But he was against the hypocrisy of a lot of the leaders. They write in the Gospels that he says that the scribes and the Pharisees, they sit in Moses' seat, i.e. that you have to do what they tell you to do. In other words, they have that authority from Deuteronomy chapter 17 of Moses that one should listen to the court. But then he says, don't do as they do because they're hypocrites. Right. So what he's focusing on is the hypocrisy. Was Jesus a Jew? If Jesus did exist, and I believe he existed, but really the only thing we really know...
That was another question I was going to ask you. As a Jew, do you believe that Jesus even existed?
There's probably as much proof for Jesus existing as there is Moses existing, right? So whether someone wants to believe in it as a matter of faith, I mean, I'm not going to attack that person. I mean, I also believe in individuals that we can't necessarily prove existed. If I acknowledge that he's the individual who appears in the gospel, he was clearly a Jew. He lived in Judah, in ancient Israel, and he suffered as a Jew. He taught as a Jew. He lived like a Jew. Now, I'm not saying that Christianity or Christians resembled Jesus of the Second Temple times. I mean, there is sort of a disconnect between, let's say, a Baptist or Catholic and a Jewish guy named Jesus or Yeshua in the Middle East. There's a huge disconnect. But for sure he was a Jew. And he was a righteous Jew. I mean, he wasn't Hellenized.
If he existed.
Correct. If he existed. But I don't want to insult anyone. There's no reason outside of historical evidence for me to assume that he didn't exist. But there is a whole set of books called the New Testament that attest to his existence.
Okay. And, I grew up with a lot of friends. They're Chabad. And what do you think about, and because you're Orthodox, what's the difference between you and, for example, Chabad, Nikki?
So Chabad is Orthodox. They're considered ultra-Orthodox. Okay. They're part of the Hasidic movement. What's the difference between regular Orthodox, which is more what I consider myself, modern Orthodox, which is more like the young Israel crowd, versus ultra-Orthodox versus Hasidic Judaism, right? So Chabad is both Hasidic and ultra-Orthodox. They're people who typically live off the more stricter interpretations to everything we do and believe, right? They go above and beyond. I mean, that's what it means to be a Hasid, to basically go above and beyond the law. The only problem I have with that is when they begin condemning others for not adopting their approach to things, right? And if you ask a Chabad rabbi, am I allowed to do something? He's going to respond just like he would respond, like if another Hasid would ask him that question, instead of saying, wait, what does the law actually allow? And am I going a little bit too far? I mean, is one
I think you're talking about Jews that don't want to enlist in the Israeli army. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
No. Now, Chabad doesn't get involved in Israeli politics.
So I know they refused to join the Israeli military.
You sure about that? I mean, Chabad? No.
Chabad, I thought it was Chabad, or maybe it was...
I mean, there's ultra-Orthodox Jews definitely who refuse to join. I'm not sure if Chabad is one of them. I know the Lubavitcher Rebbe said that they shouldn't be involved in Israeli politics. So they fall under the rubric of non-Zionists, but they're not anti-Zionist. Right?
I see.
So there's actual anti-Zionists, and not only do they not join the Israeli army, they'll burn flags and...
right, isn't that the Nutri Karta or something like that?
Right, so the Torah Karta is not a Hasidic group. Some people think they're Hasidic just because they wear shtreimels and stuff and dress like 16th century Polish nobility, but they're actually Ashkenazim, just regular straight Ashkenazim, who are anti the state of Israel. So we see them protesting alongside Palestinians and doing things like, although not all anti-Zionists do this. For example, Satmar is very anti-Zionist, but they will not protest alongside a Palestinian or an enemy of the Jewish people. But we belong to a very complex religion and group of people.
It's a complex fabric of different subcultures. Now, as an Orthodox Jew, do you recognize the Zohar?
Recognize it how?
As an actual library that's after the Talmud. So the Torah, the Talmud, and the Zohar. Is it like a compendium that belongs together?
I agree that it exists, right? But I believe that it's optional to believe. I mean, it's jam-packed with metaphysical ideas and concepts. The question is, what weight does it actually carry? Now, in Judaism, we have something called Midrash and Agadah, basically folklore and legend. The Talmud is full of them. But everyone knows that those are optional to believe. However, the portions in the Talmud that are prescriptive, that tell you how to keep Shabbat, they tell you how to keep Yom Kippur, well, they tell you that you have to do something that Jews feel that they're bound to keep because God, in Deuteronomy chapter 17, also Deuteronomy chapter 1 and Numbers chapter 11, God gave this court, these elders, legal authority over the people of Israel. He said that he was going to put on them what he put on Moses. So the way a court functions, they can't institute metaphysical ideas. Because if that was the case, they would just vote that the Messiah should come tomorrow or that our enemies should be drowned into the sea. Right? But their job is to adjudicate law, and civil law at that. Right? So the Talmud is full of law, prescriptive ideas. However, it's full of metaphysical ideas, and that's what the Zohar is. It's a book on metaphysics, on trying to dissect the complexity of God or the unity of God. There's a lot of beautiful things in the Zohar. There's a lot of silly things in the Zohar. It's definitely a Jewish work. Do I believe that God requires you to obey it and believe it? Absolutely not.
Do you believe that it was written by the hands of God? in other words.
I don't think anyone believes it was written by the hand of God. The Zohar itself states that it was written by someone named Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai existed in around the end of the 1st century. And the problem is that the Zohar was only found in 1270 of the Common Era. So you're talking about more than 1,000 years, more than 1,100 years. When the author existed, or the supposed author existed, there was a rabbi in Spain. His name was Moshe de Leon. He claimed to have found this manuscript, and he began to disseminate it amongst the Jewish people. Now, this really falls under the rubric of what's called pseudepigrapha.
What does that mean?
Basically, a work that you attribute to someone else, right?
Okay.
So like if I find a book and I say, well, George Washington wrote this book and I put it up on Amazon and everyone's going to buy it, not because it makes any sense or it's a good read, but because George Washington wrote it.
Well, it could be memoirs or something like that.
Correct.
A journal.
Correct. Right. So it definitely can be traced back. There's a lot of errors in it. I'm not against it. I mean, if someone wants to believe it, it's fine. The problem is I'm against with someone reading a concept in the Zohar and then asking you, do you believe in it? Oh, you don't believe in it? You're a heretic. Because we have to believe in everything, I guess, that appears in the library of your synagogue. So there's a hierarchy as Jews to what we believe. The first piece of that hierarchy is the 5 books of Moses. Well, the Chumash is the basis of our religion. And then all the other books, like the prophets and the writings, right, the book of Psalms, the book of, like Sefer Yeshayahu, all this, is there to bring you back to the Torah. And then there's the legal portions, which began with the Mishnah. So the Mishnah brought down laws that throughout the century traveled amongst the Jewish people orally, right? That's why it's called the oral law. And the Gemara is the commentary to the Mishnah. And these 2 books together is what's called Talmud. It's not that simple to explain. So there's a lot of people who are like, oh, well, that you believe in the Talmud, you probably endorse raping little kids and worshiping the devil and stuff. It's just because that you can't get stuck on first stage thinking when trying to understand how Judaism functions. Because it's really like an onion. There's so many different layers, man. What, are you Jewish?
I grew up with a lot of Jewish friends, and I have a Jewish background, but I'm not a practicing person or anything.
All right.
I've been to Chabad many times, and I know a lot of rabbis, but yeah.
But is your mother Jewish?
She is.
Okay. All right. So you're Jewish. If you weren't Jewish, I was gonna encourage you to consider conversion.
Now, do you believe Maimonides is important in the Jewish world?
Sure. I mean, I believe he's important, but not just because who he is, but what he brought to the table. Another name for Maimonides is the Rambam. It's the same guy. He made a big impact.
Why does he have 2 names, by the way? I've always wondered.
So Maimonides, that was his actual name. It means son of Maimon, which is who his father was.
Okay.
Now the Rambam is just an acronym that I think this may have started around 250 years ago. Jews would take the first letter of the rabbi's title and name and make, I'm not sure what you call this, an acrostic out of it, right? So Rambam actually stands for Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon.
Oh, so it's an acronym.
Correct. So Rashi is the same thing. All these acronyms that start with an R, or the Arizal, for example. The Arizal doesn't start with an R. Still same system that was put into play around 250 years ago. So that's why the Ramban, there's another guy, he's Nachmanides. So again, he's Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman. So they take the first letter and they make these little acronyms. So the Rambam is important to us because his great work called the Mishnah Torah. Now this is different from what we said before about the Mishnah. Mishnah Torah is a work where he compiled all the laws that appear in Rabbinic Judaism and what we call the oral law, and he put it in one book. In one book made up of 14 volumes. And this book he called Mishnah Torah. Why? Because like I said before, that the Talmud is full of what's called Midrash and Agadah, folklore and legend, tales that have nothing to do with law, that just happen to be there. So
are they like inspirational? Are they philosophical? Are they?
Yeah, there's advice, there's narrative of gaps that they felt were missing in the Torah, that they had to in some way respond to. Anything of a non-legal nature in the Talmud is considered Agadah, basically folklore. So he extracted all the folklore from the law, and he put all those laws in a book, so when someone needs to know what to do on Yom Kippur, needs to know that what to do on Shabbat, all you have to do is go into the Rambam's section for Shabbat, Hilchot Shabbat, and it'll lay down all the laws for Shabbat instead of having to go through the whole Talmud to get understanding. In other words, he says
so it sounds like Maimonides was in a way kind of like a distiller.
Correct, exactly.
Right, a distiller of content.
Right, so he's called a codifier, which is pretty much the same.
Codifier.
Right,
okay.
The same thing. So that's why he's important for us. But it's not that we believe that his book came down from heaven or anything like that. Right, I mean,
it's a very important tool to understand.
Right, he's a scholar and Judaism's greatest philosopher, or for sure most influential philosopher.
They call him a sage, right?
Yeah, well, all the rabbis are called sages. Like, particularly with the sages or the rabbis that appear in the Talmud. But a sage is just, like a chacham, just like a wise person. It doesn't,
Right. And do you believe that if you're not Jewish, if you're Christian, or if you're any of the other myriad of religions out there, when you practice your religion, are you interfacing or touching the same God or the same world or the same energy, if you will, for lack of a better word, really, that Jews are? Or is the God of the Jews distinct?
That's a powerful question, man. There's a statement in the prophets, and the reason, I'm going all the way to the prophets, because it's the only portion in Jewish literature that even touches on this, and it alludes to the fact, it makes a statement that the sun goes up and down and my name is still great amongst the nations. It alludes to the fact that God rejoices even in the sacrifices of idolaters. Because if you've been to India, sometimes they sacrifice for the sake of sacrificing, and they just sometimes they sacrifice to some deity known as the unknown God. That's kind of way above my pay grade to even understand what that means. According to the 5 books of Moses, it seems that God is more preoccupied with how you behave than what you believe. Now, it's really a catch-22 because, being that it's the Torah that guides our behavior, it's kind of hard to meet God's criteria for good behavior if you don't accept the Torah and i.e. his authorship of the Torah. But I think that if people do behave in an ethical manner, those people really should get as much of a reward as a Jew who behaves in an ethical manner, because it's ultimately about behavior. At least according to the 5 books of Moses. And I know there's a lot of Jewish philosophy added on later on that you have to believe in all these things. Like Maimonides or the Rambam came up with this notion of the 13 principles of faith, right? So the things you have to believe, right?
Right, so the rituals are very important, what you do in life. But in a way, don't actions kind of precede thought? So in a way, kind of think the thoughts that you hold in your mind, which in turn become actions, are also important, right?
Right. So that's why I think it's a catch-22. That it's kind of hard for you to meet God's criteria for what's good unless you believe that he's the author of these laws that appear in the Torah, which would behoove you to keep them. But still, for some person who never heard about Judaism or never heard about the Torah, and the person struggles with his nature, like he struggles to do the right thing, he fights evil, he rewards the good, I have no doubt, at least personally, the Torah doesn't really mention this, I personally have no doubt that God is going to reward that person just as much as he's going to reward a Jew who actually did good because he knew better. Right? That's just the most ethical response I could give from what we have in the 5 books of Moses. Again, religion stepping in. Well, the example I gave was the Rambam, that he developed 13 principles that one must believe in, apart from just doing. But the Rambam lived, you're talking about 1135 of the Common Era to 1205. So this is maybe 800, 900 years ago, right? But the Torah doesn't say any of these things. So, being that the Torah is the base, it seems that the Torah cares about more how you behave and not necessarily what you believe. Now, clearly, if you have a screwed up belief system, you're going to behave in an immoral manner.
Exactly.
Right? But what's the answer for someone who's never heard about the God of Israel or Torah or the Sinai experience? Are we to assume that God is just going to judge them against some standard they never accepted? Or perhaps God does have a basic sense of morality that he judges us all by, right? no matter what you believe in. As long as you do good, you're going to get good. Now, the Torah itself doesn't promise you heaven or hell. As a matter of fact, the notion of heaven and hell doesn't even appear in the Bible. It's a much later notion. It seems that our biblical heroes, our biblical characters, did good for the sake of doing good. And I think that's the most powerful reason to do anything, just for its own sake. Right? I mean, nowadays people don't want to lift a finger unless they're getting rewarded or they're threatened with punishment. So being that that's the theme that appears in Torah, and these individuals did good before they had the Torah, right? Abraham did good. He was righteous before the Torah. You know, God related with these people because they were spectacular amongst their counterparts because of their behavior. So I think in a similar way, someone who doesn't have Torah could also find favor in God's eyes because he's good.
Okay. This question might be a little, you could say, controversial in the current events. But where do people who are like transsexuals and have different types of sexual identities fit or are perceived through Judaism? Is that considered to be an aberration, or is that part of the fabric of just how the world kind of is? And how is it categorized within Judaism?
It's frowned upon. Big
It's frowned
time.
upon. Okay.
Now, when you say Judaism, I interpret that as, what does the Torah actually say about it?
Okay.
And because Reform Judaism doesn't frown upon it, nor Conservative Judaism, but Orthodoxy does, which is the most traditional form of Judaism, just because that's what the Torah says. Not only does it mention the actual act of homosexuality between man and man, it also discusses the notion of a man like wearing woman's clothing, or a woman also wearing man's clothing. So it encompasses both. However, I do think that we have to take a little bit of a step back and see who it's actually referring to. In my opinion, a lot of people who are transgendered or homosexuals or who live a homosexual lifestyle, a lot of that came from abuse. I mean, came from a lot of things that we don't understand. I don't believe that it was a choice, and I don't believe that they were born that way. However, I think the Torah would take that into consideration, although we do have a blanket law that individuals who engage, well, at least men who engage with other men, there's no law in the 5 books of Moses that prohibits lesbianism, although the oral law prohibited it later on, but that's just was something that was developed by the court. The type of homosexuality it was necessarily speaking of was gratuitous homosexuality, because it follows a law that a man shall not lie like with a beast like he lies with a woman. In other words, that doesn't come natural. Right? I mean, men typically don't have an urge to have sex with animals. This was depicting Greek society, right, where anything goes and it was good to experiment, right? It's not talking about, in my opinion, now clearly there's a law against homosexuality, and that's what the Torah says. I'm trying to be compassionate, and I'm trying to understand how was it understood, right? Like if you have a guy who's attracted to hairy legs, that's not something that he chose. You understand? You know, I mean, he's not warring against God or the law. He's just not attracted to women. I don't think that that's what God had in mind when he attached the death penalty to homosexuality. The law is the law, and I really wish the Torah would have been phrased differently. I'm not going to say the Torah says something it doesn't say, but I think that it was speaking about gratuitous interactions between men and men that we see a lot on college campus today, people experimenting. A guy may not be attracted to another guy, but because his gender studies teacher told him it's perfectly great to do and beneficial to experiment, he will try it or she will try it. I think that's what the Torah is getting at. So is it forbidden according to Torah, according to Orthodox Judaism? Absolutely. Right? Do we have to be a little bit compassionate to people's situations? For sure. So that's my response. Okay.
And is compassion a feature of the Torah, or is doing the right thing more of a feature in the Torah? I mean, is compassion, because I know like in a lot of these kind of social things that's recent about like transsexuals and homosexuality and other things, it's always presented to society that as long as it's love, then it's okay if it's a different type of love. And does the Torah kind of I guess, maybe touch on that, where compassion and love is the most important thing, or the most important thing in the hierarchical scheme of values, or is doing the right thing preeminent?
I think the Torah is pretty adamant on the notion that compassion cannot exist without standards. And it seems that in the more liberal streams of Judaism, that's tossed out the window. It's compassion for everyone without standards. Now, the Torah itself is a law code. There's no room in there for someone to overlook a law and say, I'm going to be compassionate. Well, at least it's not there black and white. Now, the court does have leeway. For example, like people could adjudicate a matter in a stricter way, like rather than a less lenient way, or vice versa. Right? And even in Judaism, it was almost impossible for this court to put anyone to death. And I think it was set up this way to give people a chance to get their act together. For example, where they needed 2 witnesses and there had to be a pre-warning, and those witnesses would have to be eligible to be witnesses. And even if they didn't heed the first warning, you're giving them an extra warning. So the Talmud has a statement that a court that has killed more than, I believe, 1 or 2 people in 70 years, or maybe 60 years, is considered a bloody court. Jews have acted in a very compassionate manner in spite of the literal laws that appear in the Torah, right? So this is why people who don't know anything about Judaism or the Talmud think that Jews are very cruel and, like put Gentiles to death. Of course, they take that out of context. But I think in almost any society, it's always the Jews on the compassionate end, always being considerate for everyone else, whether they're Jews or not. But the Torah itself, there is no law to be compassionate. I mean, there's a law to be just, not to favor the rich in judgment or the poor in judgment. Law has to be strict, and it really shouldn't waver. However, how we execute the law, that's how we can bring compassion to the table. But we shouldn't water down the Torah in the midst. In other words, there's many people who will reinterpret the Torah or say that these laws really don't apply anymore just because they're trying to be compassionate. Instead of saying, no, the Torah makes sense. The Torah is giving you standards to live by. How we execute that, how we express that, that's a different matter. In other words, you're not changing the Torah, you're changing the way you mete out judgment. Okay? It could be done in a compassionate manner, it could be done in a strict manner. But this is why it wasn't left up for people they see 2 guys having sex in the street to stone them right there. All this was always done in a judicial setting, in a court. There had to be witnesses. Every opportunity was given to help these individuals out, no matter what the strict letter of the law said.
Right. It sounds almost like compassion with discernment.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I know earlier you were talking about how, according to the Torah, if you don't have if you haven't been exposed to the Israeli or the Israel experience, that as long as you do the right thing, that's more important. Now,
it doesn't say it in the Torah, by the way. I mean,
it's not in the Torah.
No, it's not in the Torah. I wish it was in the Torah, but that's just what I think, right? Because the Bible doesn't say it. Yeah.
Okay. So what do you think about Mayans and Aztecs who didn't have that experience with in Israel, or didn't know about it, but then they were killing people routinely to sacrifice them to the sun god? Now, in their world, it was compassionate, or it was a right thing to do because they were terrified. Just for them,
right? Because they thought that they didn't sacrifice.
So, yeah. Exactly. So, according to your perspective, do you think that God would look upon them in a good light or in a bad light?
I don't believe that someone needs a good God to tell them that it's wrong to murder for them to feel wrong for murdering. I do believe that there's a basic sense of morality out there. And I never thought that the Torah is there to make you good, but it's there to make good people better. It's there to sharpen you up. I think the basic principle of not doing unto others what you wouldn't want done unto you is just ethics 101, and the notion that you shouldn't steal, i.e. steal somebody's life, steal someone's land. I think almost any unethical act is tied to these 2 concepts.
So do you think the Mayans were evil in a sense?
I saw Apocalypto.
I remember that.
A great movie. I think so. I think God would not be happy with that. That we could humanize anything. That we could say that the only reason they do it is because that's what their parents did, and when they were thinking about the greater good, if they didn't sacrifice to the sun god, then there would be a famine, there would be floods, there would, all of the above. I think that it's kind of hard to be ethical without a basic sense of intelligence. Being primitive and primal can't be your excuse always. And we see this with God. I mean, God steps in during the flood. So in the flood, it said that the people were being terrible to each other. They were stealing and they were murdering each other. Now, clearly, there was no law back then, but God didn't tolerate it. God didn't say, oh, well, one man's terrorist and another man's freedom fighter. He just wiped them out. So it seems like there is a bare ethical standard that he holds everybody by. God also destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah existed before the Torah existed. So,
right.
So there must have been a basic sense of morality that they were violating. And I think that the ancient Mayans probably resembled a lot of these old biblical tribes.
Right. Yeah. As I know, there's journals where the early explorers there knew that the local tribes were disgusted by what the Mayans were doing, and in a way feared them, and that's what the Mayans used to kind of control the region with other tribes.
Nowadays, many people romanticize all these groups, even the Native Americans. You know, the early Native Americans weren't the nicest people in the world. We see them all in a pacified state now. They're crying if someone throws trash on their, like that old commercial. But in real life, I mean, these guys were hardcore savages, man. A lot of them were cannibals. Their standards of ethics were nothing like ours. I try not to romanticize these societies and thinking that any group that didn't come from Europe, by definition, is correct. Right.
Now, is there such a thing as a Jewish gene? So I know, like in 23andMe and these Ancestry.com, and there's articles about how scientists have found the gene that is shared commonly amongst all Jews around the world.
So I took one of those tests. I took the one from Ancestry.com, and it came out, I think, like 10% European Jewish. I'm a convert. My family's from Colombia. I never heard of a Jewish gene going back to like Moses or Aaron, but I think what's understood as genetics is ethnicity. From what part of the world? In this case, it was Jewish and European. So that was an ethnicity in Europe, just like it was an ethnicity in the Arab world. They must have the DNA of a handful of Jews who lived at that time, and that's how they create their map. But I don't believe that any of that has any spiritual or religious significance. But the thought that blood matters is probably the last primitive belief that the religious world has to get over. Right? Blood doesn't matter. Right? It doesn't matter what you believe or who your parents were. If you want to behave in a certain way, if you want to accept a certain philosophy, then you're my brother. And we're united by philosophy and by actions. Blood is it's a primitive pursuit.
Well, the only reason I ask is because I know with the studies of epigenetics and the idea that throughout our environment, we're able to change our genes like in real time, and then we kind of pass that down to our children. I've heard some Jewish scholars make the argument that the reason why Jewish people that are religious are spiritually or morally, I guess, more advanced is because through the thousands of years of passing down these rituals and epigenetically kind of changing their genes, they've kind of created this being that's very compassionate, or that their spirit is more advanced than others. For example, the Mayans.
Right.
So
I've heard Chabad make such a claim. I mean, I think someone would have to be ignorant of history to make such a claim. And first of all, most Jews, I think the last poll that was taken is that 54% of ethnic Jews identify as atheist. If that was the case, the vast majority of Jews, even in Israel, I would say maybe 8% of Jews are observant in Israel. I mean, how many Jews do you know who claim to be observant, religiously observant, keep kosher? I mean, it's probably less than 10% of the Jews you know, correct? Right.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, so I don't think that people who make these claims have thought about it much. I think that the average Gentile, if that was the case, if it was left up to genetics, that they would have more spiritually superior genes than Jews. But I don't believe it's left up to genetics. Even communism. Okay, I mean, anyone who studied the founding of communism, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, it was mainly found by Jews.
Were these religious Jews or not?
They were not religious Jews. Now, Karl Marx's grandfather was a rabbi, but they weren't religious Jews. But one of the tenets of Marxism is that religion is the opiate of the masses. Das Kapital has pretty much replaced their Bible. I mean, Karl Marx is called the socialist Moses or something like that, but they're atheistical societies, and it's mostly Jews. And just go look online, Seinfeld, Larry David, all these guys, Woody Allen. The average Jew, when people think Jew, they typically don't think pious, religious. As philanthropists, absolutely, right? I mean, who gives more money to symphonies and to build parks? Jews do a lot of good in this world. But I wouldn't say that they do it in the name of God or in the name of Judaism. They do it in the name of humanism. So that's why I've never liked that argument.
And who were the Khazars, or the Khazarian Empire? Who were they? So I know there's a lot of talk about them, and that's where Ashkenazim in a way came from. And are the Khazars related to the original Israelites, or are they a completely different branch of humanity?
It was pretty much a country named Khazaria near the Caspian Sea. It encompasses part of Turkey, I think, nowadays. That the whole country converted to Judaism. This is documented in a book called Kuzari that's written by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. And in this book, it tells the story of this king. So that book was written in probably the 11th century, so then it must have been around the 10th century. But that a king that was very skeptical, or he was looking for religion. So he brought in a priest, an imam, and a rabbi. And he basically told him to go at it in front of him and convince him what's the true path. So this book, the Kuzari, is a very popular book. Like I said, over 1,000 years old. It was originally written in Arabic. This book details all the arguments made by the imam, the priest, and the rabbi, trying to convince the king from a philosophical level which one is the superior religion. So long story short, the king gets convinced that Judaism is a true religion, converts to Judaism, then his kingdom converts as well, and this is where the myth, or I don't want to call it a myth, but the story of the Khazars arose. Because they believed that Ashkenazi Jewry, i.e. European Jews, came from this kingdom. I believe in the story. I don't think that all European Jews came from this kingdom, but I believe that a bunch did. This is actually not the only kingdom that ever converted. There's another kingdom near Persia. I think it was called the Kingdom of Adib, that converted in around the same time. I mean, Judaism has been accepting converts from its inception. The reason it's controversial is that people try to ridicule Israelis and say, well, you're not real Middle Easterners. You descend from the Khazars, and that's where you belong, right? That you should just stay in Europe. Right? That's typically an argument made by anti-Semites. I mean, the truth is the land of Israel belongs to whoever keeps Torah. And being that even Abraham converted to Judaism, adopted this belief system, his parents were idolaters, it shows that it's for everyone. So whether they descend from them or not doesn't really belittle anything. I mean, King David's great-great-grandmother was a Moabitess, and she was from Moab. Ruth was from Moab. So it shows that only because you're not from Hebrew stock, what doesn't mean that you and your future descendants could also be considered Hebrews. So that's the story. I mean, what's 100% accurate? I'm not sure. We don't know if this kingdom actually existed. There's actually a book written on it. It claims to be a historical book called The 13th Tribe by Arthur Koestler. Right, it's a book written in the 70s, and he did a lot of research and proves that this kingdom, or at least tries to prove that this was an actual kingdom that converted to Judaism. Yeah.
And talking about authors, do you like David Irving and his book about the Holocaust?
Oh, wait.
About lizards.
Wait, is this
David
the same?
Irving.
Right. It's the same David Irving, right? Like the lizard people guy?
Yeah, I guess I don't know if he's written books about that, but I know he's written books about. Well, the idea was that he lived in Germany and learned the German language, and tried to collect more information about the Holocaust and people who were around at that point.
Right, he's a British historian.
Yeah,
but that was put in jail for his statements about. Well, first of all, I really haven't followed his work after that, but I know that he was put in jail for something he said about the Holocaust. In Europe now, it's a crime to fall into the rubric of what's called a Holocaust denier. Now, a Holocaust denier it's not necessarily someone who denies the Holocaust existed. I think you'd have to deny reality. It's anyone who disagrees with an accepted fact. Right? I mean, that doesn't even make sense. If it's a fact, it doesn't matter whether it's accepted or not, but an accepted fact of something that occurred in the Holocaust, whether how many Jews died, if there were gas chambers, and this and that. Right? So anyone who kind of doesn't kowtow to that established rule, it's a crime in Germany, and I believe it's a crime. It may be a crime also in England. I think he was put in jail in Germany for this. I'm not really familiar of exactly what he said against the Holocaust or Jews of the Second World War, so I don't know enough about it to respond.
And I mean, do you have a different opinion about the official story of the Holocaust, or you're pretty much in line with?
Well, the Holocaust was definitely a horrible thing. There's a lot of religious Jews who got killed. There's a lot of children who got killed. I think initially what sparked it off was the Jewish involvement in communism. This is nothing new. There's many rabbis who've written about this. I think it's Rabbi Wasserman. He wrote a book called Epoch of Mashiach, and he said that the Holocaust was a punishment by God because the Jews were involved of being nationalistic and socialistic. In other words, where they were focusing on returning to Israel in some secular effort because the early Zionists were atheists, and where they were involved in socialism, i.e. the founding of communism. I mean, this is a typical ultra-Orthodox approach to the Holocaust, that instead of asking where God was, people should ask where man was. And Hitler was known as a staunch anti-communist, so his murder of 6 million Jews was fueled by his hatred for communism and his inability of being able to distinguish religious Jews from secular Jews. The Holocaust happened, and it's horrible. It would behoove people to really understand the politics of the time and see what actually sparked it off. But Hitler didn't hate Jews because they were keeping Torah and because they put boxes on their heads or like were so ethical. He mentions in Mein Kampf why he hated Jews. It's because they were communist. But the problem of not having more Jews in the world is that Gentiles cannot distinguish between religious Jews and secular Jews. So when they have a problem with secular Jews, the Gentile understanding is that all Jews are Jews and in some way religious. So I'm going to attack the first person I could distinguish as a Jew. And this is why the religious communities in Europe that were decimated first, while a lot of the secular Jews were able to escape and lie and say they weren't Jewish. So the Holocaust did happen. It was horrific. And I think that the way for us to prevent another Holocaust is to educate people about Judaism and encourage people to become Jewish. The famous Reform rabbi's name was Leo Beck. So he said that if every German had a Jewish convert in their family, the Holocaust would never have happened. Because of the lack of Jews
So in a way, it was almost like it was like you said, there was an ignorant approach to Judaism, who Hitler believed was responsible for communism.
Correct.
Now, my last question for you is if according to Torah, Jews can't return to Israel until Mashiach has come, then the Jews that are in Israel, are they in a way kind of like violating Jewish law?
So nowhere in the Torah does it say that a Jew needs to wait for Mashiach to come to go to Israel. That's the typical ultra-Orthodox understanding. Not in going to Israel, because there's many ultra-Orthodox Jews who are even anti-Zionists who live in the land of Israel. The war with anti-Zionists...
Or to establish Israel as a state.
Right. So that's the issue that ultra-Orthodox Jews have, like having a Jewish government in the land of Israel. The vast majority of anti-Zionists in the land of Israel were there before Israel became a state. Right? So they believe this is our land, right? But we don't want you, running a secular Knesset and putting a flag with a Magen David on it, like claiming to be a resurrection of biblical Israel. So nowhere in the Torah does it say that the Messiah needs to come for this to happen. What it does say is that Israel has to repent for their sins, or basically for the sin that put them in exile. Which, the Talmud lists many different ones. I think the most popular one is Sinat Chinam, which is like baseless hatred. But I have a video on it if you go to TorahJudaism.com on why the temple was destroyed. But it says in Deuteronomy chapter 27, 28, 29, Leviticus 26, it says that when God exiles you from your land, right, for being disobedient, for not keeping the commandments, he said that he'll bring you back if you repent. And Jews are probably less religious now than, they've never been. There's a huge explosion of a lot of Jews learning in seminary, but still, it's disproportionately secular. It's hard to believe that God would reestablish the state of Israel, especially when the founders of the state that were atheists, and that the vast majority of the inhabitants aren't religious. You could be an optimist and say that, things are slowly moving in the right direction, and I see that, sure, but at the same time, it's been, from 1948 till today, and the government is still, I would say, probably 80 to 90% secular, and the inhabitants are probably just as secular. I don't know. The whole notion of Mashiach aside, you don't need a Messiah to establish a state, but it really asks the question, why is there such a backlash from the nations? Why is there so much terrorism? Right? It seems that that's God in some way responding.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, and where can people find more information about you?
TorahJudaism.com. That's it. The organization is Torah Judaism International. We teach Torah and we encourage people to become Jewish no matter where they come from. We encourage people to go to their local synagogues and inquire and pursue a conversion and be counted amongst the Jewish people and become an inheritor of all the blessings that appear in God's Torah.
Okay, thank you for joining the show, Rabbi Asher.
Cool, man. Be well.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.